Towards a New Socialism. Section. Agriculture. Free markets and agriculture are almost unknown in the developed world. The Western governments which advocate the adoption of the free market as the solution to the food problems of Poland strenuously resist any attempts to impose it on their own countries. Food markets are strongly regulated in Japan, the European Community, and the USA. The purpose of such regulation is both to ensure stability of supply and, more importantly, to cushion the politically influential farming lobby from the rigors of the market. The methods adopted differ in detail, but the general effect is to hold food prices above free market levels to protect farmers' incomes. The predictable effect of this is to encourage overproduction. Excess food is produced, which is then bought up at subsidized prices and accumulated in warehouses and grain silos. The disposition of these surpluses poses a conundrum. The simple answer would be to sell them off cheaply to consumers, but this is ruled out as it would undercut prices and harm farm incomes. Special gimmicks are resorted to. Butter is distributed to pensioners at Christmas. At Salvation Army offices, squalid scenes develop as old people queue and scramble to obtain their free pound of butter. Even worse, food is destroyed. Stocks of potatoes are deliberately contaminated with purple dye to make them unfit for human consumption. Farmers are paid incentives to leave their land idle rather than to grow food. At the same time, high prices encourage farmers to put marginal land under the plow. Water meadows, hedgerows, and woods vanish beneath grain prairies. At subsidized prices, it becomes worthwhile to douse the land with chemicals, contaminating food, killing wildlife, and poisoning water supplies with nitrates and pesticides. We reach the ultimate absurdity when landowners have to be paid not to destroy sites of scientific interest by planting conifers, which they would never have considered in the first place were it not for the incentive payments for planting trees. What now exists in the West is a crazy amalgam of public regulation and private self-interest, all in effect devoted to the enrichment of the landowner. Despite this, apologists for this system can point to the East and say, quote, "At least we don't have food queues like they do in Russia." The popular picture of communist agriculture involves permanent shortages, Russian queues, and Polish meat riots. Before the collapse of communism in the East, there were wide divergences in agricultural systems. Poland had predominantly private agriculture, while the Czechs across the border had socialized agriculture. Poland had butcher shops with bare shelves, while state shops in Prague were piled with salamis and sausages. The USSR had predominantly socialized agriculture, but was also notorious for shortages. As these examples show, it is not a simple matter of private farms being better or worse than socialized farms. Other factors, pricing policy, the distribution system, and the cultural level of the countryside, all play their part. Moreover, whether shops are full or empty is a poor measure of the effectiveness of an agricultural policy. If prices are high enough, shops will always be full. There are plenty of countries in the world where full shops go alongside hungry people. Conversely, if you hold prices artificially low, shops will sell out. A better way to judge a system of food production and distribution is to look at the nutritional standards of the population as a whole and at the ecological effects the system produces. There is now an immense body of scientific knowledge relating to diet. Even before the Second World War, nutritionists had worked out the quantities of proteins, fats, carbohydrates, and vitamins needed for a balanced diet. This knowledge was put to good use in setting wartime food rations. Although traditional sources of supply were dislocated, the rational planning and allocation of what remained meant that health and nutritional standards for the population as a whole actually increased. Some of the nutritional advice of the 1940s may seem a little dated now. Epidemiological studies into diet and heart disease have led to modern recommendations prescribing somewhat less butter and animal fats and more complex carbohydrates. But the same general principle applies. If the population as a whole consumed a diet in conformity with the latest scientific wisdom, then the general standard of health would improve. It would no longer be a matter of preventing diseases like rickets or tuberculosis fostered by chronic undernourishment, but of curbing the great modern killers, cancers and heart diseases, brought on by a poor diet. This suggests that food supplies not only can be, but ought to be, planned. For a given size and age structure of population, total food requirements can be readily calculated. This can then be obtained from three sources: imports, socialized farms and fisheries, and private farms and fisheries. We will assume that food imports are regulated by long-term supply contracts with various producer nations, which, barring major climatic catastrophes, provide a reliable base supply of those foods that cannot be economically produced at home. This leaves a known target for domestic production. If we assume that the agricultural sector is made up of a mixture of state farms, co-ops, and family farms, then the problem is how to achieve the target level of output from these sources. Agriculture is more affected by the weather than other industries. Its output fluctuates from year to year, and exact annual planning is impossible. But over a period of several years, these fluctuations even out, and by holding buffer stocks, regular supplies can be maintained. It would be reasonable to set 3 or 4 year moving targets for agricultural output. Family farms and co-ops could be asked to tender for the supply of fixed quantities of crops over a 3-year period. They would be asked to specify what inputs they intended to use in terms of machinery, energy, fertilizers, and so on, plus how much value added they were going to ask for their labor. The supply contracts could then be awarded according to a formula that takes into account both the cost, in terms of direct and indirect labor, and the environmental effects that would be produced by applying the specified quantity of chemicals and fertilizers. A tendering system would avoid the overproduction that plagues Western systems of agricultural planning. It places the needs of the consumer and the environment before that of the producer. It would encourage efficiency and hasten the closure of marginal, uneconomic farms. The farms which win contracts would be rewarded with long-term stable prices and markets. End of section.